Welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 152. If you're looking to improve your understanding of photography, well then you've come to the right place. Make sure you subscribe, click like, and leave me a comment. Say hello if you're watching live. If you're not and you're just watching the recording, then there's also 151 previous episodes you can go and check up as well. So today we're going to be looking at Janet. John and Jonas have all sent in images looking for a little bit of feedback, and also Robert and Rosemary, independently of each other, also sent me in questions about printing. Not fully my speciality, but I can certainly give you a few pointers for getting started. So all that to come up. Yes, stick around. So yes, here we are, live on YouTube. Leave a comment, let me know you're here. Tell me where in the world you're from, and or you currently are, and tell me what the weather's like too. I can see we've got a few comments in already, and Pat is here, says hi everyone. We actually have some sun here in Minehead. Well, that's good. We've actually got a bit of sun out here today in Scotland, which is quite rare at the moment, but rather nice. John says hi Kim. Maggie says hello everyone from Castle Douglas. April says hello everyone from a beautiful warm sunny day, Long Island, New York. And Janet's joined us from Mississauga in Canada. Rosemary says good morning everyone from the grey Pacific Northwest. Oh, a bit grey over there, right? Okay, and sunny everywhere else in the world except for you then, Rosemary. Right, okay, so what are we talking about? Yeah, so what I was going to say is we've had, 3 different pictures sent in, and we've also had a couple of questions about print. So I'll come back to the print in a little while. Oh, I see Andy's joined us as well. So Andy says, hey everyone from Herefordshire in UK. No, not Herefordshire, Hertfordshire. Sorry. Hertfordshire, yeah, make sure I've got the glasses on. I come to realise that an awful lot of words I read, I sort of read the first letter and then the last bit, and then just kind of my brain fills in the rest, and it doesn't always fill it in right. So I've sometimes wondered if I have a sort of slight bit of dyslexia, but I think it's just somehow the way I read words. So yes, getting confused there. And what else? Oh, John's joined us, says good day all from a wet Columbus, Ohio morning. Right, okay, cool. So, okay, I've got a little thing coming up saying YouTube is not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming. As such, viewers will experience buffering. So my apologies if you're getting buffering. I have no idea why. I cleaned the computer out. I've minimized everything to try and make sure the stream is as good as I can make it at this end, but for some reason it still seems to be going a bit funny. So anyway, hope everything is working for you. Alright, so what are we going to do? So let's make a start then. So like I say, we've had different images sent in, and I think what we will do is we'll make a start with Janet from Canada. And so where do we go? Let's start with this one. So flick across here. This is Janet's picture. Now, Janet says, I was trying to shoot a more interesting composition. I'm trying to find a more interesting composition to shoot this bridge a few weeks ago. This was shot in Prince Edward County, Ontario, over the Easter weekend, but I plan to shoot the New Brunswick to Prince Edward Island bridge in a few weeks. That's a few thousand miles away from you, I think, isn't it? From Google Maps, it looks like I will have similar angles available, but with the possibility of sunrise rather than sunset. Okay, so it's an interesting one then, Janet. So basically, Janet's going to be photographing a bridge. She's already had a go at this one, is wanting to know what other possibilities there are, given the fact she's going to get a chance at shooting another bridge, which she's already checked out on Google Maps, which I will say is a very, very good idea. These days, Google Maps, especially you can get Street View and what have you, can take you to all sorts of places, and there's a great way of planning ahead. And also, if you've got a sense of north, east, south and west, and you know which way the sun is rising, where the sun's setting, and where you will be relative to it, then you can do an awful lot of planning in advance if you know you're going somewhere interesting. So, smug points to you there, Janet, for working that one out. And so, what can we do with this? Well, one of the things is, I mean, you've got this one clearly as the sun's setting. Now, there's a few different things to think about when you're photographing a bridge. Now, one of the things what you've done here is you're going for this a kind of a reflection mirror image kind of look. to it. Now, I think one of the things you're going to do, if you're going for that kind of idea, sometimes is to try and get actually, while we normally talk about rule of thirds quite often, rule of thirds should be called guideline of thirds. With something like this, you are going for a symmetry. And in a way, the fact that you've got the poles, the lamp posts at the top, but then cut off at the bottom, and your line isn't quite in the middle, I would have said actually you would have been slightly better off. If you just go for a slightly more symmetrical above and below, something like that, I think if you're going for this kind of angle, or this kind of look rather, think symmetry. And what I would suggest is when you take the photo, give yourself slightly more room than you expect to need. Okay, so don't try and get everything exact in camera. Get it as good as you can in camera, and then pull back or go a little bit more wide angle, zoom out just a fraction. Give yourself an extra inch or two at the sides and above and below, so that you've got options when you crop. Because very often when you're actually there in the moment, you don't always see that there are sometimes extra little things around the edges, which might be useful, or you might have to crop out later. But it gives you that option, especially if, like some of us, you don't always manage to get the horizon perfectly straight, or, and again, if you're tilting, you tend to lose a little bit of all sides of the image if you're straightening the horizon. So with something like this, just shoot a little bit wider. So that's your first tip. The next thing is, if you are going for the idea of symmetry, go for the horizon dead center in the middle. Okay, because what you're looking for is the reflection above and below. Now, other things to think of with bridges are how far you can come around to the side, and how far you want to be kind of going down the length of them. Can you even kind of get so that you're pretty much underneath it, looking down the length through each of these pillars? That's another thing. Something else to consider is what's in the background. And in this case, if we kind of zoom in over here, we can see there's houses, and there's a kind of, looks like there's a village of some kind, or certainly a set of buildings. Over here, entrance to a harbourway, possibly a little boat or something kicking about there. So sometimes what's surrounding the bridge as well can be quite interesting, and depending whether you're above or below, how you're sort of standing up on a rise or trying to get down to water level, sometimes you can kind of create interesting little sort of use the bridge and the bridge pillars to frame something else. So think about how you might frame the picture, or the pictures within the pictures as well, whether that's sort of between the sort of one set of pillars and another, or even between a single, double pillar here like that. So there's options there. Also, the other thing is, if you are going for reflection, that kind of symmetry, how close down can you get to the water to take the shot? So if you think about that notion of ground level that we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, ground level photography, you're kind of wanting to be almost at water level photography, at surface level. So obviously you don't want to risk getting your camera wet, but can you get down? Is there is there a path or a platform or a jetty or something where you can actually get down to as close to water level as you can without risking your camera? And the more you do that, the more symmetry you're going to get in those reflections. Other things which are going to make a difference with the reflections, of course, is the movement on the water. If it's windy, you're going to end up with ripples and choppy. You're not going to get it as smooth. Also within that is partly the tide as well, whether the tide's coming in or going out, how much movement there might be with the water there as well. And generally speaking, if you're either at the lowest point of tide or the highest point of tide, that's where the kind of the water is at its stillest. It's sort of gone out as far as it's going to just before it starts coming in, or it's come in as far as it's going to just before it starts going out. So a little bit like when you lob a ball in the air, it kind of takes its arc and then it slows down, and there's a moment of pause before it starts coming back again. So that kind of notion of where the movement of the tide is can sometimes make a difference as to stillness of water. Although if there's wind, that's obviously going to overpower. You're going to get ripples. So maybe worth watching the tides as well, because the tides will also make a difference as to how much of the pillar, how much of the background is showing as well. So that's another thing. The final thing I would say to you here, Janet, as well, when thinking about photographing a bridge, especially if you're talking about around sunset or sunrise, is backlight or side light, or where the light is coming from. Now, in this case, what happens is presumably the fact that the pillar is lit up on this side means that the sun is off over to the left. If you were standing the other side of this bridge, looking back the way, then the sun would basically be behind the bridge and it would sort of create much more silhouette. The silhouette, in turn, accentuates the notion of shape. And sometimes with bridges, the shape is kind of, the shape is always a key part of any bridge. The shape is a key part here when you're talking about the idea of the symmetry. So, but certainly this notion of where the light is coming from, one of the things I've said many times before, and I'll continue to say, is backlight. Backlight is the photographer's secret weapon. Now, you always have to be careful. If you've got your camera to your eye, don't be looking straight into the sun, okay? The camera has a lens on it, the lens magnifies, you're likely to damage your eye. However, if you have a viewfinder at the back, especially one that flicks out or anything like that, but you can just look in the back of the camera rather than through the eyepiece, and you can compose your picture that way, then it doesn't matter quite so much if you're pointing the camera into the sun. I wouldn't recommend doing it for too long, because in turn, direct sunlight going through a lens can eventually start damaging the sensor. But for short moments, it won't make a lot of difference. But I would say if the sun's low in the sky and you can get round the opposite side of the bridge, look for options there for having the sun behind the bridge from the angle you're at, and I think that should give you some really interesting ideas. So I hope that helps there, Janet. So basically what you're looking at options of symmetry, and if you're wanting the symmetry, you want to try and be as low down, as close to the water as you can. You also want to make sure that your horizon line is in the middle, and the other thing to do is make sure you step back a little bit to ensure that you've got cropping options and horizon straightening options afterwards, without just missing out the tips of what might be an interesting bit of composition. Another bit with the composition with a bridge is to think what's through on the other side of the bridge, whether there happens to be a village or a boat or somebody fishing or anything like that, and whether you can create sort of a picture within a picture inside using the pillars of the bridge. And then finally, thinking about the light. So, interesting ideas. I wish you all the best. I look forward to seeing what you manage to get. Do send us some photos. So yeah, and also, like I say, for everybody else as well, if you know you're going somewhere in particular, and you can get a kind of street view with Google Maps, definitely worth doing. Right, I see we've got a few comments here. Janet says it's a 4-week trip starting next weekend. Excellent, sounds like fun. Rosemary says beautiful light. Janet says, oh, it's Quebec, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island and back. That's a fair old trip there. Pat says, pleasing picture, Janet. Jonas has joined us from a sunny Denmark. Welcome, Jonas. April says, love the golden reflection in the water. Meg says, hello everyone, sorry a bit late. Janet says, I did shoot under the bridge. Okay, that would be interesting, another angle. Robert's joined us, says, howdy all from Yosemite in California. And Janet says, the sunrise was behind me. I didn't find an angle with the sunrise behind the bridge, silhouetted a boathouse instead in a different shot. Yeah, always, it's worth playing around, basically, yeah. And tides are not a factor here, but will be at PEI, Prince Edward Island. Meg says, really like the diagonal and the curves of the bridge. I also like the reflection in the water too. Excellent. Okay, well, thanks very much for sending that one in, Janet. Okay, right, let's move on then. So next one up is from John. So John said, hi Kim, sorry I missed last week, I was away on holiday, and he was going to send in he was going to send a picture to do with the idea of ground level photography. As it was he sent me this picture, said this is for you to critique. This image was going to be a low down shot, but I think it works as standalone. So I asked what kind of critique. It was basically just looking for a kind of overview. So this notion of looks like a pier probably going out into the sea. We've got a sky. He's gone for the black and white, and it's a very, very symmetrical image. not messing around with anything pretend symmetrical. That's the kind of key bit, rather than saying rule of thirds or anything like that. And it's also a conversion to black and white. So John's looking for a kind of bit of general feedback on this. So the 2 or 3 things occur to me here, John. First of all, I mean, I think generally speaking, you know, it's a pleasant image. You've got you've got a good depth of focus. We've just slightly out of focus here at the beginning, but I think you've used something like an f13. So we've got everything from the lamp pillars at the front right through to the seating part down here, all in nice focus. The symmetry is creating a kind of pleasing sense in its own right. Now, what I would say though is I sometimes think one of the problems with symmetry is a kind of is if it's too symmetrical, then kind of the brain switches off a little bit. Now, I have not talked about it for a little while, but I did a while back. I did a podcast specifically on the notion of asymmetry or asymmetrical symmetry, which is sort of symmetry but not quite. And sometimes it's that not quite which enhances the whole idea of symmetry. We've evolved. Our brains have evolved to notice what's different, okay, and to filter out what's regular. We can't hold on to every bit of information that's flying in at us all at the same time. So the brain's got very, very good at filtering. And as we've evolved over hundreds of thousands or millions of years, our brains have learned to filter out what's not threatening. So essentially, you know, our ancestors walking in the savannah or the long grass, there's something not quite right, there's something just not quite right. We will turn and look. And we will look. Now, it might turn out it was just an odd-shaped tree, or it might have been a zebra that wasn't a threat. But those of our ancestors who didn't look got eaten, right? So that if it did turn out to be a lion or a hyena or something like that, we didn't survive. So we have not descended from those who didn't look for something different. Now, symmetry kind of goes to a point whereby the brain goes, okay, I get it. I no longer have to look at it to really take it on board. I look at it, I accept that it's not a threat, and I move on to something else. So something that is as symmetrical as this, I feel, whilst there's a basic kind of pleasing to the eye, there's not enough to really grab the eye and to hold on to it. The only bit of sort of asymmetry in this is I think there's a bin sitting down here in the right hand corner, but that's not quite enough. Now, maybe if this was a colour picture and all the rest of this was sort of the brown and white, and then that happened to be green or sort of stood out, it might do. But actually, if you imagine now for a moment you had a person standing looking over the railings on one side, or you had a dog, or you had a seagull just sitting on the ground sort of somewhere around there on its own. But if you had one other item in here, an object or a person or an animal or bird of some kind that wasn't symmetrical, then all the other symmetry would actually become enhanced, and the asymmetrical bit would be the thing that would really draw your attention and kind of create a much more eye-grabbing image, I think. So think about that notion of asymmetrical. Go back and check. I think I might even have bits. I'm not sure whether I got it in the bite size or not. There could be a bite size. If you go to my YouTube channel, it's just straightforwardly YouTube.com/Ayres, and there's a bite size section in one of the playlists. Flick back through that and see if you can find a bit that talks about asymmetry or asymmetrical symmetry. And I think you'll probably find that worth watching. I may well do another podcast on that sometime in the next few months, but that's my kind of starting point with this. The only other thing I would say is with this, what the next bit of feedback I would give is it looks like you're not using the full dynamic range. It doesn't look so. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open this in Photoshop a sec, because I just want to check the histogram on this, which is how much light and how much dark you've got. And if you are now, sometimes you need you don't necessarily need to be having all the blacks are black and all the whites are white. But if you're not, you need to kind of have a good reason why. You've got there's a dynamic range available to you. So the question is, why aren't you using it, or could you use it? So what I'm going to do here is if I go to levels, and what we can see is over on the right here is that there's quite a big gap. Okay, there's something like about 15%, 10 to 15% of the lights not being used. So if I grab this little slider here and pull this up, that now gives us a fuller range of light to dark. Now, it has brightened the image a bit as well, and perhaps part of the problem with that is you're wanting a darker, moodier sky. In that case, we use the mask of the levels. We turn that to black because black allows us to sort of, essentially the white is like what the effect is you're doing. The black will kind of create like a transparency, so we'll see the layer underneath. So if I just do that, we can see that it just makes it all dark again. But what we might do, let's just move this out a bit, is just say darken down the top part of that sky, something like that. And having done that, we can see that this histogram has actually moved over a bit more because that's actually where most of the brightness was. That actually allows me to grab this and nudge it up even a little bit more so that we're getting a fuller range on the decking and the building and the railings and everything else without necessarily lightening the sky. So if I remove that, what you can see is we're just really lightening up the lower part. In fact, actually, if I just flick that back to white, I might just lighten it a fraction just above the, so we're taking a little bit above the and I've forgotten the word, whatever you call it, the seat area. There's a word for it and it's gone straight out my head. Basically then, so I would say make sure that you are, use your levels, use your histogram to see so that you're using the full range, okay? And this will be particularly noticeable if you come to printing it up, and I'll talk about this in a minute when I talk a little bit more about print. But quite often things print a bit darker than you're expecting them to. So if you're not sure, part of the problem is, and I know we've had conversations with Robert about this from Texas, is that a lot of our monitors are bright. In fact, they're artificially bright. So unless you've got a calibrated monitor, calibrated and tonally calibrated monitor, then generally speaking, a lot of our devices, our phones, our tablets and our computer monitors tend to be brighter to make our pictures seem to zing. But that doesn't necessarily mean they translate across all devices. So very often we think the picture is brighter than it actually is. So the best way to check, if you're ever uncertain, check your levels, take a little look at the histogram, and then grab the edges and nudge them in. Do you need the darks a bit darker? Do you need the lights a bit lighter? And that should give you something to play with. So those are the two kind of takeaways really with this one. John, one is about this notion of the lightness and darkness, and make sure you're using the fuller range that you can. But you can do it selectively by masking off particular areas in the picture. And the other is this notion of symmetry, and symmetry can be very pleasing, but it can also kind of allow the eye to slide off it and not really stick around. And if you can put in a little bit of asymmetrical, like some kind of extra figure or bird or animal or object or something, just slightly off center, then suddenly it dramatically increases the power of the image. So I hope you find that useful. But a great image. Thanks for sending that one in, John. Right, okay. What have we got? April says, I really like this ground level picture. John says, very interesting take on viewing images. Andy says, nice image, John. April says, I like how you fix the lighting, Kim. I see the difference. And John says, lifting the histogram certainly worked. Excellent. Right, okay, little reminder then. And if you find these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, and you would like to support them in some way, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. Another thing is invite your friends along. If you're interested in photography and you feel you're gaining something from this, I'm sure you know other people who are interested in photography who would also gain from this podcast. So drag them along. let's grow this wonderful little community of ours. And right, okay, and a quick reminder as well, as if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and if you can, hit like. Somewhere down here there's a like button. YouTube likes the algorithms a bit more if you kind of click the like on them, so that helps. Right, okay, so next thing I want to talk about is I want to talk a little bit about printing. Okay. Now, I have to caveat this as a start to say that printing isn't my strong point. Virtually all my photography tends to be done where I send digital files to the client. The client then worries about printing, if they're printing at all. A lot of images are used for websites, but if they're being printed in a magazine, or somebody's printing them up for billboards or posters or anything like that, sometimes I know if I'm sending images to the magazine, I know that the magazine itself tends to print a little bit darker. So there are some things that you kind of need to take into consideration. So I kind of touch on printing a little bit. I have my own little things that I do, but I don't have a massive printer at home. If I do need to get something printed, there's a local printer just down the road, literally about 200 yards down the road from me. Very, very good. Small print in Castle Douglas, highly recommended. And they do, if I need something big printed up, they do the printing. And now, in 3 weeks' time, there is Spring Fling. I will talk about this a little bit more, probably next week and the week after. But Spring Fling is an open studio event, and at that point, I do have to have a few things printed up. It can cost, there's a cost involved in not just the print, but in the framing, mounting and framing. And so given the fact that I don't actually sell the prints off the wall, I tend to just have a set of frames made up, and then I swap the prints around. And so just to kind of give you a kind of quick example, so there's one there. Some of you might remember the Ultimate Selfie. Over there we've got that one from Bath Stories and Car Stories in the background. So these are frames that I got made up, and what happens there is, so just kind of wheel that background to me there, and I swap the prints within them. However, one of the things about printing is to understand the ratios that you're doing. Is that if you are going to somewhere like IKEA or some hardware store, and you're buying kind of ready-made frames or ready frame mounts or ready cut mounts or anything like that, a lot of these tend to come in standard sizes. So if your picture isn't a standard size, then you can end up with either a bigger gap on the top and bottom or on the sides or something like that. Now, sometimes you can get away with that. I kind of just get away with it enough. But if you are trying to if you were going to be selling these prints, you need to make sure that you've got a proper border and you've got it all lined up properly. So either you crop your picture to fit the mount and the frame, or you get a mount and a frame to fit your picture. Which one you do depends on the way you're going about it. So, if to give you a wee side here, if she tunes into watches, she'll know who she is. A little while ago, not too long ago, I was judging a competition for a local camera club, and somebody put in a picture, and it felt like quite a nice picture, but except for the fact that it felt like there was a bit missing, that really it should have been extended out. It was kind of a standard landscape crop, but I felt it would have worked so much better if it had been cinematic and it extended just a bit out. And I said that. And then afterwards, the person whose photo it was said actually it was extended out in the way they cropped it, but then it didn't fit the mount they had that they were putting in for the camera competition, so they cropped the image. So they cropped the image to fit the mount for practical reasons, except for the fact that it had lessened the impact of the photo. So you need to understand that sometimes your photo, if you've got your photo and you are really, really happy with the crop and the ratio of the photo, but it doesn't fit a standard size, then you are then going to have to bespoke. You are going to have to get a mount cut to size. You're going to have to get a frame built to size. And as soon as you go away from standard things, the price goes up. So the question is that a consideration for you? If price is a consideration, then perhaps you want to be thinking about fitting to standard sizes. But if price isn't a consideration, then you have a luxury of being able to go, well, actually, no, this is the best picture. This is the one that I want. And either I'm cutting my own mounts or I'm going to somewhere that I trust. So the thing is about standard sizes, well, fine, you can probably buy things offline, online and what have you. However, I would say it is worth cultivating your local printer and your local framer. Okay, these guys, these people who are generally small independent stores, they have absolute expertise in these areas. They tend to be also quite well known amongst those who know that you go to your local expert. So never leave things to the last minute. If you are going to, don't turn up with your prints for the Camera Club competition the night before the Camera Club competition, because you will be disappointed. You've got to usually get a 2 or 3 week run in. If you build a good relationship, sometimes these people will nudge you to the front of the queue ahead of the people that they haven't got a good relationship with. But it's worth building a good relationship with your local printer and your local framer. Okay, so that's a kind of starting point here. Now, other things I would like to say about printing are, so what else have we got here? Yes, that's a really good point here, is the fact that you need to have your print, you need to have it at 300 dpi if you're printing dots per inch. Okay, now if you've been shooting in RAW, generally speaking, that defaults to 300 dots per inch dpi. However, if you've just shot in JPEG, JPEGs tend to sit default at 72 dots per inch. And 72 dots per inch is a quarter or less of the amount of information per inch. And what that means is when it prints up, it doesn't print as clearly or sharply. So, if you've got a JPEG, go to image size. So, for example, okay, let's just tell you what, let me just briefly show you here. Let's click over to here. So if I go to image size, we can see here that when John sent this one, this width is 400, the height is 902, resolution 300. So that's a 300 dots per inch. If that happened to be 72, well, as well as being smaller, but if it was, hold on a sec, let's just undo that. If supposing I go to image size, we'll keep that width of 400 pixels. If I did that at 72 and then change that back to 400, it's the same size on the screen. It doesn't look any different, right? It's 1400 pixels across, it's 1400 pixels across. So, but 1400 pixels across at 72 dpi is fine for the web, it's fine for your screen. Your screen is set for 72 dots per inch, but print is 300 dots per inch. It's a much higher resolution. So you have to make sure if you're printing, it is set at 300 dots per inch. And the way to do that, if you've got the editing software, go to image size. Change that to 300, but also make sure that your pixel count up here is exactly the same. Because otherwise, if I change this to centimeters, you see that's 49 centimeters wide at 72 dots per inch. But at 300 dots per inch, that's going to be smaller. So let me just, I realise I'm probably, a few people will be disappearing and snoozing at this point. Key point here, if you're going to print, make sure it's 300 dots per inch, okay? That's the takeaway. Colour correction, as I said earlier about the eye, not that one. What have I pressed here? That's what I want to do, yes. Not just light and dark, difference between screen and print, but colour shifts as well. You might have a colour calibrated monitor. That means that the chances are the print is going to be the same colour. But sometimes it's not. And sometimes, again, it's worth checking out. This is where it's great to work with your local printer. If you're going to, we've had things like you go to somewhere, say like printed.com or similar kind of online things where everything's looks fine on the computer and we've sent stuff off, and when it's come back, there's maybe slight magenta shift or there's a slight green shift. And it's something to do with the way that they're set up. And so you need to understand how the printer is going to react to your photo. So that's a key element, is about understanding colour. So you might want to do some test photos first and get a sense of what adjustments you have to make on your own computer. Okay, hope that makes sense. What else do we need to hear? Another thing to think about if you are printing photos as well is gloss or matte. Do you have a shine on it? There's a temptation to sometimes go for glossy prints because the gloss seems to kind of somehow make the colours richer. However, it does also mean they tend to be slightly more reflective, so that if there's another light shining around the place, you're not always getting the information. You're kind of having to tip it around to make sure you can see the picture. Another thing is if you're going to be putting it behind glass. If you are framing it and putting it behind glass, then there's absolutely no point in having a glossy sheen on it as well. You may as well do matte. So the matte is more likely to give you a slightly better copy of the colours in a way. Generally speaking, I go for, but you've also got to think about printing. There's what's known as archival inks as well. Nearly all printing these days is done through inkjet or laser printing, and not all inks last a long period of time. They will all fade if you stick them in sunlight for over a long period of time, but if you have archival quality inks on archival quality paper, then your print should last decades, as long as you've kind of got it hanging in the shade. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So by and large, these are the kind of, one other thing to say before printing as well is that because when we're looking at a screen, the screen is brighter. Even if you have a calibrated monitor, the light is coming through the monitor, so everything looks like it's got a little bit more punch. Whereas a photo is reflected light, so it's always going to appear slightly duller. So one of the things you nearly always need to do is just lighten it a fraction normally. Just light it, grab this the little histogram and just nudge it up a little bit before you go to print. And another thing is to slightly sharpen it a little bit more than you would as well. Not massively, but you just want to, because you don't want to end up with too many kind of artifacts, but sharpen it a fraction more before it goes to print, because it's being printed essentially tiny little droplets of ink onto paper. They can blur into each other a little bit, and so what a picture that might look razor sharp on your computer can look fractionally softer when printed. Okay, so all in all, your key points for printing: make sure it's 300 dots per inch for printing. Okay, make sure you've got the colours and the tonal range as you want them. Try out, if you can, a test print and then check it against your monitor so you can see whether you need to lighten or darken it. Generally speaking, you need to lighten them a bit and sharpen them a bit. So those are the things you need to think about kind of before you actually send the print off. Then there's your notion of ratio and whether you're fitting it to a mount and a frame, whether you're wanting to go for a standard size or whether you're wanting to customize it. And then finally, this idea of cultivate, make friends with, build a good relationship with your local printer and your local framer. These are the people who will absolutely save you when it comes to last minute charging about. A good printer will sometimes, and as they get to know you, they'll get to know what adjustments maybe they need to make to your pictures in order to make sure that they look their best. Okay, your local framer, your local printer, these people have the expertise that just sending something off to something generic online will never do. Something generic online will be cheaper, probably slightly more convenient, less waiting time in that sense, but it's not going to give you that extra level of quality. So you're balancing up all the time that level of quality against that level of cost, that level of convenience against level of expertise. So to both Robert, and to Rosemary, who sent me in questions about printing. I hope those answer your questions. But if I haven't, or there's anything else you just want to throw into the comments, please do. Right, okay, so thank you for that. Let's see if we've got a few more comments here. April says, I put some of my photography on Canvas. There are a few companies that do this for you via the internet and they will ship it to you. Yep. Andy says, I use a local printing company as they will let me sit and review with them on their colour balance screen before printing. I've had mixed results sending images away as mine is not calibrated. And that's absolutely it, and I think Andy is there really just summed up the wonders and the of cultivating your local printer and framer, is because if they will allow you to sit with them, and because you've spent all this time getting the image you want, you've then spent all this time editing it to the level you want. You don't want it just being messed up because it went off to some generic printer who didn't really necessarily understand the subtleties and the importance of your creation. April says, I like these companies. For a little extra money, they will fix the colour for you. Rosemary says, thanks for the printing tips, Kim. April says, I have to check for private printing companies around here that are good. Yeah, and certainly ask, if you've got friends who've used them, ask around, but try them out as well. And Rosemary also says the portion about tonal range is especially helpful. Excellent. Good. I'm glad that was useful. Right, okay, finally then, we're on to Jonas from Denmark, and he says, I got an email from Jonas saying, I recently discovered Understanding Photography, and what a great resource you've created here. Thank you. Little smug moment for me. It even works with just the audio when I'm driving to work. I'll look up the pictures you talked about afterwards. Now, I have to say, actually, that really caught me by surprise, because when I very first had the idea of doing podcasts, of course, everybody was doing audio podcasts. And I suddenly thought, oh, I'm doing pictures. I can't do it audio only. I have to do it on YouTube, or I started off doing it on Facebook Live. I thought video was absolutely important. And I still think, for the most part, you still kind of need the video. But the idea that some of this actually still makes sense, even if you're just listening to it, I found really quite interesting. So thanks for letting me know about that. He says, I've attached a picture I took a few weeks ago on a trip to the beach with my kids. So let's just find that picture for you and show you the picture. So he says, I like it very much, and more so, So the more he's looking at it, the more he's enjoying the photo. The way the folds in the trousers mirror the waves in the water, the arms and the legs acting as leading lines towards the heads, and the what are they looking at story. The colours and the contrast between the slimy green and the dry bone stones. Maybe it needs a bit more air to breathe at the top, but then the horizon would probably have ended up centred, which I suspect would detract from the image. There was a certain amount of luck involved, of course, but I worked quite hard to get a composition I liked. Not so easy when one child avoids the camera and the other strikes oppose the moment there's a camera around. Oh, don't we know this? Yes, this is very true. There's some kids that will just run away from the camera, and others who will just instantly go into a particular kind of pose that you've seen 100 times and you're trying to get them out of, but that's what they feel as that. I remember when I was a child, we have all these photos of me standing rigidly to attention in front of all the photos. I've got no idea where I got that idea from, but somehow as a small child I seemed to feel that as soon as the camera was pointing to me, I had to be standing rigidly to attention. And my dad would try and get me to change my position, but I didn't really understand because I was just doing what I thought you had to do. And now we look back at the family albums and all you can see is a little 4-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old child standing rigidly to attention in all the photos, and it looks awful. Anyway, so he goes on. Seeing as I was happy with it, happy enough with it to hang it on my wall, why send it in? Well, I do like it because it's a picture of my children from a lovely trip together. Or is it a step above a lovely family memento? And assuming cooperative children, how could I have improved the photo? Apart from fixing the tilting horizon, I always seem to tilt it slightly. I haven't done any editing. So, okay. So basically, Jonas has created this photo, he's shot this photo, it's done, apart from a slight tilt of the horizon, has done virtually no editing to it, is happy with it as it is. But is wondering whether it gives us anything more than, well, it will give happiness to him because they're his children, and as we know, when we're there, we take the photo, it's not just the scene, it's everything else going around it. So there's an emotional connection to what the day was like, to the fact that these are his children. Also, at the point Jonas was taking the photo, he could smell the sea, he could hear the sounds, he could feel the rocks underneath his feet. There were all these other sensory experiences there. So every time he looks at this photo, he gets all those sensory experiences recalled. When anybody else looks at the photo, all we see is shape and line and form. So, is there enough in here to make it a really interesting photo for anybody else, other than proud dad? So there's a kind of a mix here. I think you're definitely onto something. I think all the bits you mentioned before, there's a nice kind of line in the shapes of the bodies. Children are looking out to sea. There's interesting textures. Your fear of having a dead center line horizon, as I said to John earlier, don't get too hung up on it. You're not far enough off the horizon for it to actually be into rule of thirds, so it kind of looks like it's centered anyway. But what I do tend to feel is that you probably do need a bit more space above the head and maybe slightly to the left. So what we'll do here is let's open up the picture in Photoshop. And so I'll just close that one of John's, and I'll just actually swap the workspace over here so I'm not interfering with the picture. So we have the picture here. And now there's a couple of different things going on, I would say, or possibilities for, if we're talking about the idea of how might you improve this. And I think certainly more space. Generally speaking, what we tend to find is most photos are either not close enough or not far enough away. We tend to automatically go for this sort of middle ground, and photos can very often be improved by zooming in or by pulling out. Now, in the case of zooming in, I don't know that there is a lot we could do with zooming in. We could, if we do something like this, where we cut out the bottom, there's maybe an interesting shape, but we become even more aware of the fact that we can't see the faces. It doesn't really matter that you can't see the faces because you know what the faces are. Or rather, I'm talking to Jonas here. None of the rest of us know what the faces are. So there's perhaps not as much. And also what happens then is, having zoomed in, we end up with this big block of pink coat, which isn't interesting enough to occupy so much space. So zooming in this case isn't really the option. But what happens if we zoom out? Now, there's a couple of different things here. One is that notion of space to breathe to give more of a sense of, but there's also, I notice there's little reflections coming down in the water here. And I sometimes think reflections can be quite interesting too. So what I'm going to do here is, I'm going to use the content aware crop. So first of all, let's just actually give this a little bit more room to breathe. So let's stretch this up to the left a bit and over to the, up and left a bit. And then if I click enter, like this, now we've got a little bit more space around them. And I think immediately that feels a little bit better. When we were kind of in the original, it feels cramped up against the edge. You know, they're like they're being pushed into the corner. So a little bit more space, and keeping them roughly in that kind of rule of thirds into the left part here, I think kind of works. The fact that you've got the line through the middle on the horizon, I think that's fine. That doesn't really matter, because in a way, the rock pool, the lower part, the edge of where the water reaches the rocks, becomes a kind of rule of thirds line in itself. However, you could take that. What if you wanted to create that? If we now take this up and actually make it into a third, and we'll need to bring that one over a bit. Let's take that up higher. So now we're going to actually create that horizon and put it on a third. Then we'll take the girls over to this third point here, and then press enter and see what the content aware is going to do. That's not bad. Now, obviously, I would suggest you do this in camera, not trying to piece it together in Photoshop afterwards. But all we're doing here is trying to get a sense of what it would look like if you'd actually either stood further back or you'd zoomed out, depending on the lens you have or where you're at, and actually given more space around. And I think when you get to something like this actually, I think, becomes a slightly more engaging photo. We've now, depending on the clouds in the sky or whatever. What we're talking about here is shape. We're talking about the fact that we have this flat horizon, we have the pebbles and stuff in the foreground, and then we've got space, and then we've got the girls projecting above the horizon line. That horizon line is now at that point of thirds, and there's something reasonably pleasant about the composition with this. I think that kind of works a little bit more. There you get real sense of that movement in the space. So now with more of the beach here, there's a sense of the girl in the pink coat having kind of walking towards the sister. Okay, so that's one way of going about it. Another is, what if we actually were to put the horizon actually go the other way? So what we do is we have that horizon in the upper third. And then, let's do a crop. So let's try that again. I'll just take that up to there. I will need to we'll just arrange that a little bit over, and then content aware kicks in. And now what we're doing is we're placing that horizon on the top third. And at this point, this also becomes a kind of interesting one. And now we've got much more to do with what's happening in the rocks. Now, what the content aware isn't doing, because it doesn't know what it's looking at, what it's doing is it's copying bits of rocks to fill in the space. But I would say that what would actually happen when you were there would be, the interesting bit would be these reflections of the trousers. And what you would find is the reflection of the coat and the silhouette. So into this space here, you would have something a little bit more interesting with the reflections. And I think that has potential. And then at that point, although the horizon is on the rule of thirds, actually you end up with where you're playing with symmetry. To go back to Janet's idea where we're talking about the bridges, so where you create a symmetry with the reflection, and the middle line of this essentially cuts through pretty much where her foot, where the feet are. So with that middle line being through the feet, you could actually, if the reflection comes down to the same kind of distance, and you leave roughly the same amount of distance above the head as you would below the head in the reflection, then at that point you would you could have quite a nice kind of symmetrical feeling going on with so let me just zoom out a little bit more with the picture there. So that's another option. So really, Jonas, I think it is a case of your original picture does feel just too cramped in up in the top left. So your options then are either, so you can pull out a little bit, just give it a little bit more space. That feels slightly more pleasing. You can go for the big sky and have them with a kind of a low horizon, or we can go for the smaller sky but the big foreground and go for the reflections in the rocks. Either of those are extra possibilities, ways you can explore playing around with this image, I think. So I hope that gives you a few ideas to play with. But thanks very much for sending that one in, and I hope you found that useful. Right, a couple more comments here. Meg says, I really like the bits of green colour in the water. And April says, I do like the picture with more water and less sky. Oh, yeah. It then has an entirely different feel to it, I think. Okay. Right, so, yes, so, little reminder then, if you're finding these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, and you would like to support them, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. And also make sure you subscribe, drag your friends along and get them to subscribe too. Now, this pretty much brings us towards the end. Oh, sorry, I've got another one. Oh, Jonas says, thanks, I should have tried a water level shot. Yeah, that would have been fun too. So, yes, next week then will be another opportunity for you to send in your images for feedback. There are very few places on the internet where you can get personalised, genuine feedback on your photos. Most of the times we put our photos up online, or up on social media. Our friends click like because our friends are being nice. Most of us don't have lots of photographer friends who are going to give us proper critique, so they will say they like it to be supportive, or because they like the content but they don't necessarily understand some of the more intricacies of understanding your light, understanding your editing, understanding your leading lines. So this is a place to be able to give you the feedback. So make sure you make the most of it by sending in your images. Get them in by Friday at the latest, but if you can do them earlier in the week, then that certainly helps me come up with a few solutions beforehand. Just a quick little projection ahead. We will be, as I say, on the last weekend of May is when Spring Fling weekend is on. I'm going to be occupied that weekend, so there won't be a podcast on that weekend, which is something like the 28th, I think, of May. What I am going to do, though, is prior to that, I'm going to be setting a challenge, actually to do with reflections. But I will give more information about that in the next couple of weeks. But for this week, for next weekend at least, there's an opportunity for you to send your images in for feedback. All right. So yeah, that brings us to an end. Thank you to Jonas, to Janet, and to John for sending your images in, and to everybody else who's turned up and left comments and said hello. So look after yourself, and okay, now I need to kind of somehow find that bit, and enjoy the rest of your week. Take care. Bye-bye. Oh, wrong one.